Good afternoon. I'm Matt Denhart, president of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, and on behalf of the Coolidge Foundation, our Board of Trustees, the state of Vermont, the Coolidge Historic Site, and the Coolidge family, it is my honor to welcome you here to Plymouth Notch for the Centennial celebration of the inauguration of President Calvin Coolidge. It was 100 years ago in this small village that President Coolidge was sworn into office by the light of a kerosene lamp at 2:47 in the morning by his own father, Colonel John Coolidge. Many gathered here last night, earlier this morning, as we recreated the scene. More than 100, perhaps 200, gathered to see this transfer of power recreated. We have a brief program planned today with remarks from Coolidge biographer and Coolidge Foundation Chairman Amity Schlaze, from Vermont's 80th Governor, Jim Douglas, and from members of the Coolidge family, Christopher Coolidge Jeter and Jennifer Coolidge Harville. Then we'll reenact the scene again at this more humane hour. Hopefully we'll hit around 2:47 p.m. You'll have to forgive us if we're a minute or two off. But first, please rise and join Bill Wiles of Castleton, Vermont, who will lead us in the national anthem and then in another fun patriotic song. Mr. Wiles.
I expect the Coolidge Senatorial Tabernacle Choir to sing with lustful voices. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Because you all sang so well, you can be seated. When the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us pledge allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be faithful to a land so rare as we raise our voices in a solemn prayer. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam, God bless America, my home sweet home. Now for the big finish. God bless America, my home sweet home. Nicely done.
Thank you, Mr. Bill. Now, the inspiration for much of our work is Coolidge's biographer and our foundation chairman, Amity Schlaze, who's the author of Coolidge, a biography that appeared and was a New York Times bestseller in 2013. Please welcome Amity Schlaze.
Good afternoon. a reminder on the chronology. In the 1920 presidential election, when we were still in the shadow of World War I, Senator Warren Harding of Ohio and Governor Cal Coolidge of Massachusetts were elected president and vice president, respectively. This Centennial Week is also a sad week because it's the week when we mark the passing of President Harding on August 2. Vice President Coolidge was right here in Plymouth on vacation, his home and birthplace, when he acceded to the presidency in the night of August 3. Coolidge served out Harding's term. He won election on his own and handily in 24, and he left office in 29 after his one elected term. So I'd like to welcome C-SPAN viewers, this audience, and just go over some more details of Coolidge's arrival and departure in the office of the presidency. These two stories, the beginning and the end, are kind of like bookends to the book that was Coolidge, or the bookshelf that was Coolidge, swearing in and deciding not to run again in 1927. That's when he made the decision. The bookends tell us something about the nature of the Coolidge presidency, its utility for us, and why he won so handily in 1924 when Coolidge did run. So you commence with the homestead inauguration, what we are honoring in Plymouth Notch. And you know that Plymouth Notch then was even more isolated than it is now. No train came here. The town was not really wired. The Coolidges did everything here. The town was called Plymouth Notch, but it also could have been called Tocqueville. It was a very traditional American family of the kind captured by Tocqueville. Very traditional American town in the same way. So when the president passed away, telegrams went to nearby Bridgewater, and a man in Bridgewater came running over to knock on the Coolidge door, and Father Coolidge, also known as Colonel Coolidge, got the news, called up the stairs, as you'll see in the reenactment. There was no important Supreme Court justice here to swear in a new president, so Coolidge and his father consulted the Constitution, and they decided his father was a notary, could swear him in, the son, to the presidency by the authority of a notary. And Father John, Colonel John, did swear in his son after a prayer. They brought a Bible for the swearing in, but Coolidge, I'm told, did not put his hand on the Bible. That was not the family or the Vermont way at that time. People apparently asked Father John, who told you you could do this, that just a notary could do this? And well, Father replied, nobody told me I couldn't. Well, that line is very American. Under the 10th Amendment, all powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states or to the people. So the people swore in Calvin. This is important not just because it was unusual, but because it reflected what we discovered was the quality of the presidency of Coolidge. He rode down the train to Rutland, he became president, and he served as a constitutionally rigorous president. That is, he led with restraint and respect for the other two branches. He believed framers did not seek an ever larger government, so as President Coolidge held the line on spending, you know that when he left office, the government was smaller than when he came in. Coolidge believed the framers didn't want the federal government to be burdened by debt. He'd seen studied what Alexander Hamilton had done with presidents, in particular President Washington. So Coolidge brought the debt down by 1/3. He believed the framers didn't want heavy taxation. After all, our revolution was partially over taxation, and so Coolidge cut taxes as president. He who holds American citizenship is the peer of kings, Coolidge said, and he actually believed that and practiced that. The people liked it when Coolidge did run for election in 1924. It was a three-way race. Usually a three-way race means somebody wins by a plurality, first past the post, right? This was a strong three-way race. The third party, the party of the progressives, took more than 16% of the popular vote. Coolidge nonetheless won by an absolute majority. Very rare. He beat the other two parties combined. That's how much Americans trusted him. Now, I'm going to come to the second bookend, the closing of the presidency, summer of 1927. The parallel to this event, Coolidge established a summer White House in South Dakota in the Black Hills, very near where the sculptor Gutzon Borglum was getting ready to cut into the granite and sculpt the giant busts of Presidents Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. Presidency was therefore on everybody's mind, including Coolidge's, for that was the summer he had to decide whether he would run for a second elected term. Everyone thought he would. Coolidge was popular. Coolidge was so popular, if you can imagine, the sculptor Borglum even suggested in print that somehow Coolidge go up on Rushmore as well. This is a fact we find astounding today. Coolidge ranks 24 in the C-SPAN poll and then lower in some other polls. But it gives you a sense for how loved Coolidge and his policies were. And of course, his party was aching for him to run. They imagined Coolidge would have long coattails. Well, Coolidge did ride up to Rushmore on a horse named Mistletoe. And he did bless the Rushmore project, probably ambivalently because it involved spending federal money. But around that time, he also did something else. One day in early August, and he was marking this anniversary, he handed out to reporters a piece of paper that said, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. Well, the reporters could not believe it. They fastened on the ambiguity. I do not choose to run. Well, maybe if someone picked Coolidge, he would run. No, he meant what he said. And in his autobiography, he tells us why he did not run when he could. He said it wouldn't honor America if he stayed in office. The chances of wise and faithful public service are increased by a change in the presidential office after a moderate length of time. It's good to have a president who doesn't think of himself as a king, who serves rather than rules. Coolidge said, it's a great advantage to a president and a great safety to the country for a president to know he is not a great man. Through these events, the opening bookend, which we mark today, the closing bookend, Coolidge was sending America a message. Even a modern president in the era of cars and telephones can act like the framers, and the framers' style of operation can work in the modern world. After all, voters liked his traditional ways. They saw how he applied them, and they elected him on his own in that dramatic 1924 fashion. I think Coolidge's demonstration of the validity of old constitutional principles in the modern world is his greatest gift to us. At the Coolidge Foundation, we've sought to share this with younger people so they can make up their own mind and study whether we should bring these principles to life again. There are 100 young Americans here watching, our Coolidge senators. They'll make up their own minds. Meantime, many of us here, many of the welcome guests, hope that the Coolidge style of governing will be marked not just today in a ceremony, but for 100 years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Amity. Our next speaker is Vermont's former governor, the 80th governor of Vermont, Jim Douglas, who will share with us thoughts on the inspiration that Coolidge provides leaders today. Governor Douglas.
Matt, thank you so much. I want to thank you and Amity, our CEO, for your leadership of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. I also want to thank Rejoice Sherry, the site director here for the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. Calvin Coolidge's son, John, donated most of this property to the state many decades ago. He also founded a private foundation in memory of his dad, and that public-private partnership continues to work day in and day out to preserve the legacy of our 30th president. You know, the more I learn about Calvin Coolidge, the more impressed I become. I guess that's because I really think he's relevant to our political discourse today. Think back to what was going on in the 1920s and how Coolidge responded to the challenges of that time. During the 8 years of the Harding and Coolidge administrations, the federal debt actually declined every year. There was restraint in spending as he oversaw the federal budget with a fine-tooth comb. He lowered taxes. The top marginal rate of the personal income tax declined precipitously during those years. He valued entrepreneurship. Remember, he talked about the fact that the chief business of America is business. He was an egalitarian. He spoke eloquently about the tremendous contributions that black soldiers made during the recent World War. He valued inclusivity. Earlier this morning, we welcomed a dozen new Americans at a naturalization ceremony just a few steps from here. And Coolidge said on numerous occasions that the strength of our country is its diversity, how we welcome people from different lands, different cultures, different races, different creeds, all to become part of the American family. But perhaps most of what I admire about Coolidge is his civility. I think about what we hear today in our political world, and I remember Coolidge speaking once about why he abhorred negative campaigning. He said, "I always thought it more useful to explain why I ought to be hired than why the other candidate ought not to be." I haven't heard that lately in the world of American politics. He reached across the aisle. He was someone who wanted to engage with members of the U.S. House and Senate, regardless of their political persuasion. He had them often over to the White House and plied them with griddle cakes and Vermont maple syrup. Earlier today, we heard about Coolidge's speech to the American Legion in Omaha during his presidency, and he explained how having different ideas is okay. It's perfectly natural that not every American hold the same view on every issue of public policy. And just because we have different points of view doesn't mean that anyone is wrong. He explained that the strength of our American political system is the fermentation of ideas when different thoughts are put forward, debated, and discussed. He said if we all agreed on everything all the time, or if we only listened to those with whom we agree, that would lead to paralysis. So when I hear the coarse and incivil discourse that we have in politics today, I think back 100 years to a different era, a simpler time, a place like Plymouth Notch. And although Calvin Coolidge may have been inaugurated 100 years ago today, he is unquestionably a man for our time. So on this centennial of his inauguration, I hope we'll remember his humility. I hope we'll remember the modest man from this tiny hamlet who became the leader of the free world. America could certainly use Calvin Coolidge today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor Douglas, for those thoughts and for your own example in the Coolidge tradition. We've been blessed to work with the Coolidge family here at Plymouth Notch to preserve this site, to make it available to guests, to share the Coolidge legacy, whether that mean artifacts on display, help with research, or showing up at 2:47 in the morning to reenact something that happened 100 years ago. We thank the Coolidge family for their partnership and their stewardship of the president's legacy. We're privileged today to hear from first Christopher Coolidge Jeter, President and Grace Coolidge's great-grandson, who will share memories of President Coolidge. Chris.
Well, here we are at the Centennial anniversary of Calvin Coolidge becoming president. In some ways, it feels like the celebration for the 75th anniversary was just 10 years ago. I don't know how many of you, there may be a few of you that were around and here 25 years ago, but yeah, it doesn't feel like it was 25 years ago. But one of the special things, time does have a way of passing by, but however, one of the special things about this historic site is that time seems to stand still, with things pretty much like the way they were 100 years ago. I think back to the numerous times coming up to Plymouth to visit with my grandparents. In the summer, I would sometimes assist Liza Hoskisson, who worked here at the homestead, greeting visitors at the entrance and punching their tickets as they entered. My grandfather, John Coolidge, the surviving son of the president, had a great command of the English language. He always seemed to have the right words at the right moments. I imagine that trait was due in part to his father, who was also skilled in communication, despite his reputation for brevity. Another trait that these two men had in common was keeping a low profile. Neither one sought the spotlight or desired any special attention. I recall a time when I was assisting my grandfather, tidying up around the family grave site just down the road from here. A visitor stopped by and, assuming we were cemetery caretakers, commented that it must be quite an honor for us to care for a presidential gravesite. We agreed it was and just kept on working. In my opinion, Calvin Coolidge's character was one of his strongest qualities. Some of his character and values were shaped by his parents and grandparents in his childhood. Some formed later in life during his years of public service. He left us with many notable quotes. Here are a few of them that convey President Coolidge's character. His memories as a young boy of his own father. The lines he laid out were true and straight, the curves regular. The work he did endured. If there was any physical requirement of country life which he could not perform, I do not know what it was. From watching him and assisting him, I gained an intimate knowledge of all this kind of work. His reflections on the presidency. It is a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know that he is not a great man. When a man begins to feel that he is the only one who can lead in this republic, he is guilty of treason to the spirit of our institutions. And lastly, a quote regarding his decision not to run again for president in 1928, where he commented, "We draw our presidents from the people. It is a wholesome thing for them to return to the people. I came from them. I wish to be one of them again." As Governor Douglas just pointed out, strong character is still much needed these days. And although Calvin Coolidge in his final years commented that he no longer fit with the times, it would be good to have a few Calvins around today. Thank you.
Of course, many point out that Calvin may well never have become president were it not for a wonderful decision he made as a young man to marry Grace Anna Goodhue, born of Burlington, Vermont, who became the first lady and certainly was that special magic behind Calvin Coolidge. For reflections on Grace Coolidge, please welcome her great-granddaughter, Jennifer Coolidge Harville.
Thank you. Good afternoon. For almost a quarter of a century, she has borne with my infirmities, and I have rejoiced in her graces. That's a quote from Calvin Coolidge. It was in this poetic fashion that President Calvin Coolidge described his wife, First Lady Grace Coolidge, my great-grandmother. Indeed, was a clever and extraordinary woman. Grace's service to her family and country earned the esteem of her contemporaries and contributed in important ways to the many achievements President Coolidge secured for the American people. Grace Anna Goodhue was born on January the 3rd, 1879 in Burlington, Vermont. A graduate of the University of Vermont, Grace was the first lady to complete college. After college, Grace moved to Northampton, Massachusetts to train as a teacher of the deaf at the Clark School. It was in Northampton that Grace met my great-grandfather, Calvin. After a brief courtship, the two married on October the 4th, 1905, at the home of Grace's parents in Burlington. My great-grandparents had a strong and loving bond. About their marriage, Calvin wrote, the plain facts, end quote, were that he and Grace thought they were made for each other. Calvin and Grace welcomed their first son, John, my grandfather, in September 1906. Their second son, Calvin Jr., arrived in April 1908. Grace took primary responsibility for raising the two boys. Her devotion allowed Calvin to pursue his career in law and politics, which eventually led to the White House. Grace lived the American suffrage movement. She voted in the first national election where women enjoyed the franchise. It must have been a special thrill to see her husband's name on that 1920 ballot as candidate for vice president. And at this point, I want to forward to what we're about to do today. We're going to do the 100th reenactment of the swearing in of our 30th president after the death of President Harding. So I wanted to just say a word about when I have played the part of Grace in past years, I've worn my present day clothing because I didn't really know what she wore. So I would just wear, a skirt, a blouse, and then I decided, well, for this 100th anniversary, how can we bring her essence and her clothing back to the actual swearing in? So I had to do a little bit of research. I had Rejoice Sherry, the site administrator, help me, and we found some descriptions and prints, and she sent me a sewing pattern for some of the dresses back in the 1930s and 40s. And then I had a good friend who sews, and so I had her make this dress for me. And it resembles what she wore. And she had to put something on really quickly because she was called out very quickly to the parlor for the swearing in, so she couldn't get too dressed up. When the Coolidges arrived at the White House, Grace expected the furnishings to reflect its previous residence, and it saddened her to find so little original furniture. At Grace's request, Congress passed a joint resolution to authorize people to donate historical gifts to recognize the president's house as a functioning museum. The White House Green Room was refurbished under this plan. Primary among Grace's duties were serving as hostess-in-chief. She expressed pleasure at serving in this role. In no sense does it overwhelm me, she wrote to her Pi Beta Phi sorority sisters. Rather does it inspire me to increase my energy, and I am so filled with a desire to measure up to this God-given task that I can almost feel strength poured into me. As First Lady, Grace was always accessible. She enjoyed brisk morning walks around Washington. She was an icon of fashion, but also very down to earth. She had a passion for America's favorite pastime, earning her the nickname the First Lady of Baseball. And that would be the Red Sox, of course. Grace also loved animals, keeping many pets, including dogs, cats, and birds. A raccoon, Rebecca, was sent one year to be part of the Coolidge's Thanksgiving meal, but was instead adopted as a family pet. In Grace, the American people saw a first lady, and indeed a first family to whom they could relate. The First Lady outlived the President by nearly a quarter of a century. Grace spent her golden years in Northampton, dedicating herself to her community and family. She served as president of the board of the Clark School for nearly 20 years. She especially enjoyed spending time with her son, John, and his wife, Florence, and her granddaughters, Cynthia and Lydia, my mother, whom she lovingly referred to as her precious four. Following her death in 1957, the New York Times described Grace as warm, outgoing, understanding, and wrote that Calvin could not have picked a bride who would more successfully fill that role of First Lady. Calvin indeed was blessed to have Grace. As we celebrate the centennial of the Coolidge Presidency, may we remember Grace and recall the service and contributions of this remarkable First Lady.
The moment is approaching when we will recreate this scene. Of course, it happened again at 2:47 a.m. on the morning of August 3rd, 1923, 100 years ago. We'll have a very brief change of set, but please stay where you are. It'll be very brief, and then we will begin our reenactment. I now invite those on the podium to Amity, you can have a seat down here, and our three actors. The governor will be playing Colonel John Coolidge, the father. Jennifer will be playing Grace Coolidge, and Chris will be playing Calvin. You can go ahead and wait here. Okay, now we'll change the set. Okay, I'd now like to invite the cast up onto the porch of the homestead. And we'll move this way. Now I'd like to introduce our narrator, a relation of Grace Coolidge, syndicated columnist and good friend Cal Thomas.
Thank you, Matthew. Please hold your applause. Thank you very much. I see it didn't take much encouragement. All right. So, just inside the Coolidge homestead, the quiet transition in our country's leadership took place on the night of August 2nd to 3rd, 1923. What happened and who was there? Let's meet the cast of characters. Vice President Calvin Coolidge and his wife, Grace Goodhue Coolidge, have been visiting Coolidge's father, John Coolidge, since July 8, and were planning to leave the next day to visit friends in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Those also present the evening of August 2nd into the early hours of August 3rd included U.S. Representative Porter Dale, Irwin Geiser, Coolidge's stenographer, Joseph Fountain, 22-year-old editor of the Springfield Reporter, also a representative of the Associated Press, Joseph McInerney, Coolidge's chauffeur, and Winfred Perkins, who we will meet in a moment. Here's the story. President Warren Harding had been traveling, took sick, and died about 7:30 p.m. Pacific time on August 2nd at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco. President Harding's secretary, George Christian, sent a telegram with the news to the White River Western Union office in Woodstock, Vermont. At 11:30 p.m., Nellie Perkins, who was operating the telephone switchboard at her home in Bridgewater, received a phone call with the news that President Harding had died. Mr. Perkins, wrote down the telegram message and immediately awoke her husband. Winfred Perkins dressed immediately and drove with the message to Plymouth Notch, about 9 miles away. Around midnight, Mr. Perkins arrived at the Coolidge home. Mr. Perkins knocked loudly on the door, woke up John Coolidge, and...
Colonel Coolidge, an urgent message. What's all this commotion? What in tarnation? What's going on at this hour? Harding just died. Mrs. Perkins wrote that, sent it down with her husband's knee. Well, thank you, Mr. Perkins. Calvin! Calvin!
I was awakened by my father coming up the stairs, calling my name. I noticed that his voice trembled, as the only times I had ever observed that before were when death had visited our family. I knew it was something of the greatest nature had just occurred. He must have also been moved by the thought of the many sacrifices he had made to place me where I was in the hope that I might sometime rise to a position of importance, which he now saw realized. He placed in my hands an official report that President Harding had just passed away. My wife and I at once dressed. Before leaving the room, I knelt down and asked God to bless the American people and give me power to serve them.
Irwin Geiser, Coolidge's stenographer, and Joseph McInerney, Coolidge's chauffeur, were staying in Bridgewater at Furman's boarding house. They heard the news and drove to Plymouth in the Vice President's Pierce Arrow, arriving just after Winfred Perkins. Coolidge prepared the text of a telegram to be sent to Mrs. Harding, The telegram said, "We offer you our deepest sympathy. May God bless and keep you." Reporters arrived in Plymouth Notch. Coolidge dictated a statement to the American people, typed by Geiser.
Reports have reached me, which I fear are correct, that President Harding is gone. The world has lost a great and good man. I mourn his loss. He was my chief and friend. It will be my purpose to carry out the policies which he has begun for the service of the American people and for meeting their responsibilities wherever there may arise. For this purpose, I shall seek the cooperation of all those who have been associated with the President during his term of office. Those who have given their efforts to assist him, I wish to remain in office that they may assist me. I have faith that God will direct the destinies of our nation. It is my intention to remain here until I can obtain the correct form for the oath of office, which will be administered to me by my father, who is a notary public, if that will meet the necessary requirement. I expect to leave for Washington during the day.
The president's statement was handed out to reporters on the scene. The reporters rushed away to Ludlow and other neighboring towns to file their stories. But young Joe Fountain, representing the Springfield Reporter and Associated Press, arrived a bit later and decided he would remain in Plymouth to see what might happen next. Mr. Fountain was joined by U.S. Congressman Porter Dale.
Mr. Coolidge, the country is without a president. You should take the oath this evening.
Congressman Dale was campaigning for the U.S. Senate at the time. Upon arriving, he urged Coolidge to take the oath of office right away. Calvin Coolidge walked over to the general store and placed a call on the store phone to consult Attorney General Harry Daugherty on proceedings for taking the oath of office. Meanwhile, Colonel John Coolidge had located the words of the oath of office in the United States Constitution, a copy of which was kept in the family home. Mr. Geiser typed out the oath on 3 strips of paper that were later signed by those present.
Well, Calvin, raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Calvin Coolidge,
I, Calvin Coolidge,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States,
and will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Colonel John affixed his notary seal on each copy at 2:47 a.m. Calvin Coolidge became the 30th President of the United States, the only president to be sworn in by his father. After taking the oath, the President and First Lady went back to bed. The next morning, Calvin and Grace arose at 6:45 a.m. Calvin visited his mother's grave in the Notch Cemetery, and the first couple departed for Washington at 7:30 a.m. The rest, as they say, is history. Let's give a hand to the cast.